Hey guys, we have CCL starting back up. I know it's been a little bit since I've brought some videos out. I've been kind of taking a teeny bit of a break. Was kind of excited to get some patch notes out here, but it seems like the patch notes might be delayed by a week or two, so let's get into some CCL gameplay. We are going to be looking at another set of Why the Pros Play. This time around, we are in the last season of CCL in 2021. I think it'll leak into 2022, so I might call this the CCL season 2 of 2021, or I don't know. We'll figure it out. We're looking at Lunara. Why the pros are playing Lunara? Well, firstly, I want to mention that Lunara has had kind of an interesting experience in the competitive scene. Back in CCL, she was rather weak. She was used for basically two things. One, as a counter pick to specific healers. Uther being a main healer, she was used as a counter pick against. Generally, the old build was to kind of abuse the Splintered Spear to fire off four targets to get the poisons on. Then you would use your W to apply longer duration poison to everyone. You'd use Unfair Advantage. While everyone's slowed, they're taking more damage. And against Uther, who couldn't really keep up with AoE damage, it was almost a guaranteed win if they didn't end up kind of picking an extra healer near the end. So first picking Uther was just a huge risk with that possibility. Then she was picked as a kind of an answer to the roaming meta that was kind of picked up at the end of HGC, where you could pick up something like Sentinel Wisp and block out a huge zone of the map where you basically would never die to a roam. But she dropped in popularity when the roaming meta dropped, when a lot of people didn't really have the communication they had during HEC, and as CCL started coming back, the meta was just a little too bruisery, and the healers at the time were just a little overwhelming in their AoE healing. We saw a lot of Brightwings, a lot of Stukovs, a lot of Malfurions, all things that kind of countered this playstyle of Lunara. So why is she gaining more popularity again? Well, you see, whenever I do a patch notes and I say they're kind of buffing underutilized talents, sometimes I'll mention that this buff isn't big enough to make a difference, or I'll say this buff is probably enough to make a difference. Well, one talent that I slept on the first time that it was buffed, but not the next two times that it was buffed, was a level 7 talent called Choking Pollen. Choking Pollen says Noxious Blossom deals 100% more damage to enemies afflicted by Nature's Toxin. It increases by 200% against enemies with 3 stacks. So the way that works is Nature's Toxin, it's a stack per every 3 seconds on the target. There's a little bit of leeway between the 9 seconds and the 6 seconds. So if they're at 7 seconds, it's considered 3 stacks. 7, 8, 9 seconds is all considered 3 stacks. At 1, 2, 3 seconds, it's considered 1 stack. And of course, 4, 5, 6, it's considered 2 stacks. So that gives you an idea on how the stacks work. So now, how does it work to get those 3 stacks off? Well, oftentimes they'll take, at level 4 you can kind of go with anything, but most people have been taking Blossom Swell, another talent that was kind of underutilized and buffed. Increases the range of your Q and the radius by 2 seconds. Blossom Swell applies 2 stacks of Nature's Toxin to enemies hit. So the way that it works is if you get a single auto attack on a target, then you can throw your Q, and at least you get the 100% more damage, and then they get all of their toxin on them. But generally what people want to do here is they want to get 2 auto attacks, a W, and then a Q. Because the Q has a little bit of a delay, you can actually cast the auto attack. You can do the auto attack, then you can do a Q, an auto attack, and a W. And it should still get the crit off of the Q if your timing's right. Those are the major reasons why we've been seeing Lunara a lot more, because the one downside of Lunara was that she had no burst damage until 10, and you had to use an ult and reposition to get that burst damage. Now, with Blossom Swell and with Choking Pollen, you'll find yourself doing a significantly higher amount of burst damage, because your Q is actually a lot of damage. 200 damage on an 8-second cooldown is not bad, especially if you consider that your average assassin is 1800 health. So if you're doing 200% more damage, then you're doing 600 damage, which is a third of your health. So the fact that Lunara now has an ability on an 8-second cooldown at a pretty long range that does a third of an assassin's health, a fourth of a bruiser's health, a fifth of a tank's health, is pretty big. I mean, if you think about it this way, how valuable the talent on the level 16 talent is on what's his name, Tychus, to throw that grenade and finish off a target that's on their last 15% health. I mean, 5% from the talent, but with the added damage that he has with just the grenade itself, he does about 15% of someone's health. That is so valuable that it's often sometimes one of the reasons that Tychus is picked beyond just his trait. And so to see that she has that potential as early as level 7, and it also works on the Immortal, so it can give her a little bit of race. But the fact that she has that burst potential at 7 is great, and at level 10, you end up being one of the highest burst heroes. You can throw an auto attack, a W, a leaping strike, and a Q, and that gives you your 3 stacks, and then you pop them. You get to do that, and you can even leaping strike back over to get the rest of the damage out. So 2 leaping strikes ends up being 700 damage, and your Q ends up being a little over 600. So between the 600 and the 700, we're looking at 1100. They only have 600 health left. A couple auto attacks at 119 damage. You can 100 to 0 an assassin that's isolated within about 3 to 4 seconds in this build. And that gets a little bit shorter as the game goes on. You get a little bit better scaling. You get some more talents along the way. You can really drop people, especially with a little bit of extra damage from your team or a little bit of setup from your team. A good tongue, for example, is enough for you to get that extra burst and lead to a kill that you otherwise wouldn't have gotten in a slower build. So we can see the talents that he's taken. Sentinel Wisp for kind of that avoiding the roaming that you might have to deal with. And then we see the Blossom Swell for the extra range. And then we also see the Choking Pollen. All of these give you kind of what you need to make Lunara what she is. And keep in mind, again, Choking Pollen does not need to be heroes. It does not even need to be specific units. It works on structures. It works on minions. It works on the Immortal. It works on camps. So it speeds up her camp clear actually pretty well, to the point you don't really need Nature's Culling if you can do it correctly, which is you need to auto attack the 3 minions, auto attack the 3 minions again, get a W, a Q, and it's usually enough. You can kind of intertwine Q earlier if you want to get the second one, because that takes about 6 seconds to do that. So you're pretty safe to starting a camp by getting like a Q, couple auto attacks, a W, a couple auto attacks, another Q, and then you'll get the big spike on it, and that's usually enough to kill a wave. You could potentially get the first 3 auto attacks off before your Q to get the first burst, but honestly, if you just engage it, like start with a Q and then do 1 rotation, you can end it with a Q usually. Level 7, you can go with Thornwood Vines, or you can go with Leaping Strike. I still am not sold on switching to Thornwood Vines. A lot of the pro players will switch to Thornwood Vines because they now have their burst damage with Choking Pollen. Thornwood Vines allows you to get your stacks faster, and so you can get your stacks, you can get the burst, and you never need to jump into the enemy team. So it's safer. And the other thing that it can do is, you saw that slow. He was able to slow it so his team could lead to that kill. And that slow is because he used Thornwood Vines to get a stack on the enemy so that he could slow them with W. Thornwood Vines is sometimes used with Let Them Wither because you can... was it Let Them Wither or is it the cooldown reduction? I don't know. We'll see what he goes. But it is really good to set up kills in the competitive scene. But I would say outside of the competitive scene, if you're still trying to do most of the work yourself, I would say Leaping Strike is probably still better for carrying on your own, where Thornwood is better in a competitive setting where you can throw it at a range, slow the targets, and then get your stacks high enough to where you can finish them off with a Choking Pollen. All in all, this playstyle is pretty competitive, and if you're in a competitive environment and your team is doing really well at following up targets that you're slowing, you're setting up, then I would recommend trying out this playstyle. It's pretty strong. It's more about utility than it is about the burst potential, or about the overall damage numbers. If I was to check the damage numbers, I wouldn't be surprised if Greymane had higher damage, or even Dahaka. But where it really shines is more in just the overall potential that you can bring. So let's talk about the early game, the mid game, the late game. So we kind of just talked through the early game, so let me talk a little bit about what your goal is in the early game. You don't have your burst yet, and you're not taking Nature's Culling, so you don't really gain a lot of macro potential. So the early game, you kind of just want to double soak and make sure your team doesn't lose too much. You kind of lose most trades in the early game because you're missing the burst and you don't really have unfair advantage or any of the other talents that you need to really overwhelm the enemies with damage. It's a little risky to try as well. So early game, your job is to stay in the game, play safe until you hit your power spike at level 7. When you hit level 7, you have your power spike. You can start following up your tank's DPS, like I said. Auto attack, Q, auto attack W, and that generally will get your 3 stacks before the Q procs. You can practice it a little bit in try mode if you are missing that crit, but that's going to be what you want to do to try to finish off targets that your team's already attacking. I do not recommend trying to solo kill or go for anyone yourself just yet. I would only use this to follow up what your team's doing. Level 10. You can start working on solo kills with Leaping Strike, practice in try mode, the combos that you're going to be wanting to do, and you can certainly lead to those in the mid game. If you're playing a competitive environment or you want to play this safer play style, you can go with Thornwood Vines, and then your mid game is going to be setting up opportunities for your team more so than anything else. Level 13 in a competitive environment, he generally takes Abolish Magic. Abolish Magic is Cleanse. It's Cleanse on an assassin. It's the only assassin that gets Cleanse. It's not as good as Cleanse, but it does have its own benefits. 1, it's a 20-second cooldown. 2, removes damage over time and disabling effect. So where it's not as good as Cleanse for removing CC, it's better than Cleanse because you can remove damage over time effects. So if you're going against Akira, you can remove her dot. You're going against Azul, that giant damage over time, you can remove that. It even works against the damage over time that's applied by Mal'Ganis' other ult. So it's really good in the competitive environment, but I wouldn't take it if you're trying to carry. I would probably go more, if you were going to go Thornwood Vines, I would probably go more Let Them Wither, so you can slow everyone by 60%, doesn't decay, and it lasts longer. And if you're not, I would maybe go Endless Spores, or Greater Spell Shield, so you can jump in and not get bursted. Abolish Magic also does remove it from yourself, so if you do find yourself getting in a bad situation, you can cleanse an ally, even if they don't have anything on them, and you can remove all of those from yourself as well. Overall, it's a really interesting build and a really interesting playstyle. So in the early game, you saw that they did kind of struggle. I think they took a few too many fights. Mid game, they're down both of their forts, where the opposing team is only down 1. They also have damage on their lower keep. So overall, they've been struggling most of this game. As we start reaching the late game, you're going to notice that the power spikes start to adjust a little bit. The burst potential, the overall slows that he's going to be applying, the vision that's preventing the enemies from flanking, all of that's going to start adding up significantly in the utility that Lunara brings. As the games go on in the competitive environment, you need less and less damage because your damage dealers are getting more talents that are allowing them to do more damage. Most people don't have a lot of talents that increase their survivability, so the fact that you can increase your damage pretty reliably with your damage dealer's talents, then utility gets more and more valuable, which is exactly what this Lunara build is going to bring. Brings cleanses, brings vision, brings slows, brings a little bit of damage, but most of it's going to be healed up by the Brightwing outside of the burst that we've been talking about. And I don't expect it to get nerfed too soon. It is pretty powerful, but I don't think that it's going to be, I don't think it's busted. I think that it will eventually be answered. But I don't think it'll be completely destroyed with this choking pollen. So right here, he did cleanse. I think he just wanted to remove this slow. But I think he just wasn't really sure. Again, it's a 20-second cooldown. You could probably use it as much as you want. If he would have used it here, I think that it would have been much more valuable to get rid of the polymorph or get rid of the slow that kept him there with the in the silence, than using it on the Greymane. But hindsight's always 20/20, and I think that he's just trying to get as much value off as possible. So again, he's using the Wisp to distract Hogger, and in fact, he's done a pretty good job at distracting Hogger and also distracting the Tychus. And during that whole time, his team was able to reestablish control. They were able to get their Diablo healed back up a little bit. His Diablo did get polymorphed. He's not using a cleanse on it. He already used his Thornwood Vine, so now the fight's looking a little bad. We have the kind of the knockback there, and they're probably going to need to reset and reapproach this fight. So now at this point of the map, when you're starting to get behind, the one benefit to going this build instead of the Leaping Strike version of this build is that Leaping Strike, if you get ahead, you get enough damage to 100 to 0 someone without doing a lot of auto attacks. When you get behind, every 4% health that the enemies get, that you don't get that extra 4% damage, is going to set you away from killing those targets. So if you try to like 100 to 0 a Hanzo and you're even levels, you could probably do it without any auto attacks. If you're down a level, you probably need an auto attack. You're down 2 levels, you might need 2 auto attacks. And so it can get a little bit challenging with that. Level 16, there are a few talents you can take that all have a lot of potential. But particularly in this build, the goal is to try to get as much single target damage as possible. So we actually see Invigorating Spores come out. It's great on this map because it gives you more race, but it's also really good into their comp because it gives a lot of percent health and single target damage. So it's used to get that extra value. You'll sometimes see people take Starwood Spears. I personally wouldn't recommend it too much. It's just extra range, not extra damage, where Invigorating Spores is extra damage, what we kind of need from Assassins. You'll sometimes see people take the Noxious Blossom Recharging Faster, the Accelerated Contamination. Again, it's good in this build, but it can be a little bit of a bait. What I'll say about this talent is, depending on how squishy their frontline is, this could be a little bit more valuable. But overall, it's not that great. Your cooldown's already pretty low, and you already have the burst. And then the last option is Unfair Advantage. I wouldn't recommend taking Unfair Advantage unless you're going to be taking Splintered Spears. So if you're taking Choking Pollen and you want to be taking Invigorating Spores, I would be also taking the cooldown reduction. Now again, in the competitive environment, Cleanse is valued so much higher, and the time in fights is going to be a lot lower. But outside of competitive, this will lower your cooldown to where you almost have full uptime on Invigorating Spores. 6 seconds is what you're going to be having the Crippling Spore attack speed bonus on, and your W cooldown will be 10 seconds, and then you'll shave off 4 seconds of it, so you'll have 100% uptime on that attack speed if you take those two talents together. Again, I'm not trashing Haswabs for not taking these together because of the value of Abolish Magic in a competitive environment. My only concern, I would say, is how little he's using Abolish Magic. It's pretty obvious whenever the Diablo charges in, he's getting polymorphed, or he's getting slowed by Stukov. He should almost always be using the Abolish Magic to remove that, so that the Diablo can reposition and potentially go for a flip. If he charges and gets polymorphed before the flip, that's pretty bad. But if he can charge and then potentially get abolished, it could be a lot more valuable. So I guess that's my only concern right now, is if you don't use Abolish enough, then it would have been better to have no cooldown on Endless Spores. And Endless Spores is really easy to keep no cooldown on because of Thornwood Vines. So split between these two builds, what ends up happening is if you do take those talents, all these talents, and you shift Abolish to Endless Spores, you have a ton of single target sustained damage because of Invigorating and because of Endless Spores. You also have a lot of AoE damage because you're going to be applying Thornwood Vines to a lot of people, and you're going to be hitting them with Choking Pollen. So you're going to be doing a lot of AoE, burst, and you're going to be doing a lot of sustained damage. And the cool part about this is Thornwood's likely going to apply to 2 people, so you'll be able to constantly get the benefit of Endless Spores over and over and over. So it's a really fun build, and it gives a lot of value in carrying games with Lunara. I would say there's also a possibility where if you don't trust your healer, you're solo queuing, you could potentially go siphoning instead. But again, that's if you don't trust your team. If you're going to be playing this playstyle of Lunara, you definitely need to be able to move around in fights and trust your healer to heal you. You may need to make some adjustments if you don't. It's kind of like playing Greymane. He can be really, really powerful, but if you don't trust your healer, then you're going to struggle. So you can see now that this game has gone on a little bit longer, it looks kind of easy. It looks to the point that they're kind of just cleaning up whatever they want to, and there's not much the enemies can do. And it's because the entire enemy team is slowed every fight because of Thornwood Vines into Crippling Spores. The front line is getting melted by the extra % health damage that's being done, and if the enemies are slowing them with the Stukov looking to get sorry, not the Stukov. I keep saying Stukov into the silence. If they're getting stunned or slowed by, they're polyed or slowed, then the Abolish Magic is removing it, and it's going from there. Level 20, we see Forest Walk. Thornwood Vines now applies 2 stacks, makes it a lot easier to get to your kind of critical point. Increases the Thornwood Vines range by 30%, and it also increases Lunara's vision range a little bit, which is I guess it's a little beneficial, but it's probably just icing on the cake, really. The reason people are taking this talent is mainly the extra range and then also the extra stacks. The range is definitely important because you can play safer. This is a safe build. It's meant to do stuff from a safe distance. So this was why the pros are playing Lunara. This is why she's gained a lot of popularity as of late. This is also how you can make adaptations to make it a little bit more powerful in your games. Now, feel free to go through, watch some CCL, follow Haswabs, tell him hi. He's a streamer that streams most days around kind of the European times. Feel free to follow 30K on their adventure through CCL. 30K, as also many of their members make content for the game. They do tournaments, they do a lot of stuff. So definitely a shout out to all of them. Otherwise, feel free to check out any of my other videos, and you guys have a wonderful day.